Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez stood in the equipment room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, staring at her trembling hands. It was early morning, barely 5:30, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of distant bees. She clenched her fists tight, willing them to be still. For a moment they obeyed. Then the tremor returned, subtle but unmistakable. She had been an explosive ordnance disposal specialist for 8 years. 8 years of saving lives, of walking toward danger while everyone else ran away. 8 years of steady hands and steadier nerves. But 6 months ago, everything changed. The incident in Kandahar had been routine until it wasn't. A secondary device, one they hadn't detected. The blast took 2 of her team members and left her with a severe concussion, fractured ribs, and something the doctors called essential tremor, a nervous system condition that made her hands shake, especially under stress. They told her it might improve. They told her she could manage it. What they didn't tell her was how people would look at her differently. How doubt would creep into every interaction, every assignment, every moment she tried to do the job she loved. Still shaking like a leaf, Rodriguez? The voice came from behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Lieutenant Derek Maines. He was the newest officer assigned to the EOD unit, transferred from a desk position in Virginia. He had a crisp uniform, a condescending smile, and exactly 0 field experience with live explosives. Maya turned slowly. "Good morning, Lieutenant." Maines stood in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, looking at her with that expression she'd come to recognize, a mixture of pity and superiority. He was tall, probably thought he was handsome, with the kind of confidence that came from never actually being tested. "I'm just saying," he continued, stepping into the room, "maybe it's time to think about a transfer. Admin work, training duty, something where steady hands aren't a matter of life and death. No shame in it. You've served your time." Maya felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "I'm cleared for duty, sir. Medical and psychological evaluations both. Cleared on paper, sure." Maines gestured with his coffee cup, sloshing liquid dangerously close to the edge. "But we both know there's a difference between passing a test and being ready for the real thing. When you're staring down a live device, those shakes could get people killed." It took everything in Maya not to point out that Maines had never defused a live device in his life, that while she had rendered safe over 200 explosive devices, he had been pushing papers and playing politics. But military hierarchy was military hierarchy, and Maines was an officer. "I understand your concern, sir," she said instead, "but I'm confident in my abilities." Maines laughed, actually laughed. "Confidence doesn't steady a hand, Sergeant. Look, I'm trying to help you here. The evaluation board is meeting next month. I'll be providing input on all team members. I'd hate to have to recommend your removal, but if I think you're a liability..." He left the threat hanging in the air between them. Maya watched him leave, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. She looked back at her hands. They were shaking harder now, fueled by anger and frustration. She had survived firefights, defused bombs that could level city blocks, lost friends and colleagues, and come back from an injury that would have ended most careers. And now this bureaucrat with a shiny new rank was trying to push her out. The rest of the day dragged with the weight of dread. During the morning briefing, she caught Maines whispering to Captain Torres, both of them glancing her way. During equipment checks, she noticed other team members watching her hands, their expressions uncertain. Doubt was contagious, she realized. One person questions your ability and suddenly everyone does. By lunch, Maya sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich she couldn't taste. Her phone buzzed. A text from her younger sister, Emma, who was in college studying engineering. "How's my hero doing? Kick any butt today?" Maya smiled despite everything. Emma had always believed in her, even when their parents had questioned her decision to join the army. Even when everyone said EOD was too dangerous for anyone, let alone a woman in a male-dominated field. She typed back, "Working on it." The afternoon brought training exercises. The team gathered in the simulation facility, where they practiced procedures on dummy devices. Maya worked through the scenarios methodically, her muscle memory taking over even as her hands trembled. She completed every task successfully, but she saw the looks. She heard the silence that followed her successes, not celebration, but relief, as if they'd all been holding their breath, expecting failure. Maines observed from the corner, clipboard in hand, making notes. Every time Maya glanced his way, he was shaking his head slightly, writing something down, building his case. After training, Maya stayed late, practicing alone. She ran through procedures again and again, adapting her techniques to compensate for the tremor. She had learned to brace her arms differently, to use stabilizing tools, to work with the shake instead of fighting it. Her success rate in simulation was still perfect. But she knew that wouldn't matter to Maines. He had decided she was a liability, and he was going to make sure everyone else saw it too. That night, lying in her quarters, Maya stared at the ceiling. She thought about quitting, about accepting a transfer, about walking away with her dignity before Maines could push her out. It would be easier. It would hurt less. But then she thought about the 23-year-old version of herself who had walked into EOD training terrified but determined. She thought about every bomb she'd defused, every life she'd saved. Every moment she'd proven that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being afraid and doing it anyway. She thought about Emma's text. My hero. Maya's hands were still trembling in the darkness, but her resolve was solid as steel. She wasn't going anywhere. The call came at 3:17 in the morning. Maya was already awake, had been for hours, when her radio crackled to life. All EOD personnel report immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. She was dressed and moving within 2 minutes, her training overriding the fog of sleeplessness. Outside Fort Bragg was alive with activity. Lights blazed from buildings that should have been dark. Vehicles raced across the grounds. Something big was happening. The briefing room was packed when she arrived. Captain Torres stood at the front, his face grim. Maines was beside him, looking pale. The rest of the EOD team filed in. 6 specialists, all with the same alert, focused expression that came from years of training for moments like this. Listen up, Torres began without preamble. At 0200 hours, base security received a credible threat. An explosive device has been planted somewhere on this installation. We don't know where. We don't know when it's set to detonate. What we do know is that the threat is real, and we have approximately 6,000 personnel on this base, including families. A chill ran through the room. Fort Bragg wasn't just a military installation. It was a community. There were schools, housing areas, a hospital, children, families. We're implementing a quiet evacuation, Torres continued. We can't risk a panic, but we're moving all non-essential personnel to safe zones. EOD team, you're splitting into 3 units. We've identified 3 high-probability locations based on the threat intelligence we received. He pointed to a map projected on the wall. Team Alpha, you take the main administrative building. Team Bravo, the vehicle depot. Team Charlie, the old munitions storage facility on the east perimeter. Maya's stomach tightened. The old munitions facility. It had been decommissioned years ago, but still contained residual materials. If a bomb went off there, it could trigger a chain reaction that would devastate half the base. Rodriguez, Torres said, looking directly at her. You're on Team Charlie. Before she could respond, Maines stepped forward. Sir, with respect, I recommend reassigning Team Charlie. Given Sergeant Rodriguez's condition, perhaps a less critical location would be more appropriate. The room went silent. Every eye turned to Maya. She felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Could she do this? Torres frowned. Sergeant Rodriguez is one of our most experienced specialists. Her medical clearance is current. Medical clearance doesn't account for field conditions, Maines pressed. Team Charlie is the highest risk location. If there's any chance of compromised performance, I can do the job, sir. Maya's voice cut through the room, steady and clear. I request to remain on Team Charlie. Torres studied her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching, willing him to see beyond the tremor in her hands to the steel in her spine. Team assignments stand, Torres said finally. You have your orders. Move out. The briefing dissolved into controlled chaos as teams grabbed equipment and headed for their vehicles. Maya was pulling on her protective gear when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Specialist James Chen, one of the younger team members. Hey, Sergeant, he said quietly. For what it's worth, I'd rather have you on my team than anyone else. You're the best we've got. The words settled warm in her chest. Thanks, Chen. Let's go to work. Team Charlie consisted of Maya, Chen, and Specialist Patricia Walsh, a calm, methodical tech with 4 years of EOD experience. They rode in silence to the old munitions facility, each lost in their own thoughts, their own preparations. The facility loomed against the pre-dawn darkness, a sprawling complex of concrete bunkers and steel doors. It had the abandoned, haunted quality of places that had once been vital and were now forgotten. Security had already established a perimeter. Floodlights illuminated the main entrance. Threat intelligence suggests the device is inside the central storage bunker. Torres's voice crackled over the radio. Approach with extreme caution. We're working on getting you building schematics, but records are incomplete. This is going to be a manual search. Maya took a deep breath, centering herself. This was what she trained for. This was what she was born to do. They entered the facility, sweeping each room with detectors and cameras. The air inside was stale and cold, thick with dust and the metallic scent of old weapon storage. Every shadow could hide danger. Every corner could be their last. 20 minutes in, Walsh's detector began chirping. Got something, she said, her voice tight. Northeast corner behind the old storage racks. They moved as one unit, careful and coordinated. The storage racks were massive metal shelves, rusted and empty now, creating a maze of corridors. Maya's headlamp cut through the darkness, and then she saw it. The device sat against the far wall, and even from a distance, Maya knew they were in trouble. It wasn't some crude homemade bomb. This was sophisticated military grade. Multiple components, redundant triggers, anti-tamper mechanisms clearly visible even from 10 feet away. Command, this is Team Charlie. Maya spoke into her radio, keeping her voice calm. Device located. Sophisticated construction appears to have multiple fail-safes. Requesting remote diagnostic support. Copy that, Team Charlie. Stand by. But even as she said it, Maya saw the timer. Digital display counting down. They didn't have time to stand by. How long? Chen asked, seeing her expression. 47 minutes, Maya said. Walsh swore softly. That's not enough time for a full diagnostic protocol. Not for something this complex. Maya moved closer, her trained eye cataloging every wire, every component, every potential threat. Her hands were shaking. She could see them trembling as she held up her diagnostic scanner. But her mind was clear, clicking through possibilities and procedures with the precision of a computer. Command, she said. I need everyone evacuated from the east quadrant of the base, minimum 1 mile radius. Do it now. Rodriguez, what are you seeing? Torres's voice was sharp. Enough explosive material to level 3 city blocks. Multiple trigger mechanisms. This was built by someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who knew we'd find it and wanted to make sure we couldn't stop it. There was a pause. Then Torres, can you defuse it? Maya stared at the device, at the maze of wires and circuits, at the timer counting down. 45 minutes now. Her hands shook as she raised them as if in answer to the question. She thought of Maines, of his mocking voice. Those shakes could get people killed. She thought of the 6,000 people on this base. The families. The children. Yes, sir, she said. I can defuse it. The first rule of bomb disposal is to never rush. The second rule is to trust your training. The third rule, the one they don't write in manuals, is to make peace with your fear and work anyway. Maya knelt before the device, her kit spread out beside her. Chen and Walsh had retreated to a safe distance, as safe as anywhere could be with a bomb counting down nearby. She had insisted. No reason for all of them to be in the kill zone. Talk us through it, Rodriguez. Torres's voice came through her earpiece. Back at command, they were watching through her helmet camera, a team of experts ready to advise. But they all knew the truth. She was the one here. She was the one who would live or die based on the next 43 minutes of decisions. Initial assessment, Maya began, her voice steady even as her hands tremored. Military-grade C4 explosive, approximately 20 pounds. Primary trigger appears to be timer-based, currently at 42 minutes, 18 seconds. Secondary trigger mechanisms visible. Possible pressure sensors on the casing, potential anti-tamper switches on the access panels. She paused, studying the construction. Whoever built this knew their craft. The components were arranged in a deliberate pattern, each one protecting the others. Remove the wrong piece, cut the wrong wire, and the whole thing would detonate. There's something else, she continued, leaning closer. The timer mechanism has a secondary display. It's showing radio frequency activity. This isn't just timer triggered. It has a remote detonation backup. Silence on the other end. They all understood what that meant. Even if she beat the clock, someone somewhere could push a button and end it all. Can you jam the frequency? Walsh's voice tight with tension. Not without risk of triggering the detonation, Maya replied. Whoever designed this planned for that. The jamming attempt itself could be read as a trigger signal. Her hands hovered over the device. In the harsh light of her headlamp, she could see them shaking, a visible tremor that made her fingers blur slightly. For a moment, doubt crept in. How could she do this? How could she trust these unreliable hands with so many lives? Then she remembered it was 3 years ago, in a small village outside Kabul. A car bomb, similar complexity to this one but buried under rubble and surrounded by civilians who refused to evacuate because it was their home. Maya had worked for 6 hours in 100-degree heat, her hands steady as stone, talking a young Afghan boy through his fear while she slowly, methodically, rendered the device safe. When it was done, the village elder had taken her hand in both of his. "You have the hands of God," he'd said through the translator. "They bring life where there was death." She had believed him then. She had believed in her own capability, her own worth. The explosion in Kandahar hadn't taken that away. The tremor in her hands hadn't erased 300 successful defusals. Mains's mockery didn't change the fact that she was still the same person, the same soldier, the same expert. "I'm beginning disarming sequence," Maya said. She selected a tool from her kit, a specialized probe with a fiber optic camera on the end. Slowly, carefully, she inserted it into the seam of the device's casing. On her heads-up display, the interior components came into view. What she saw made her blood run cold. "Command, we have a problem. The device has 3 separate trigger systems, all interconnected. Timer, remote detonation, and..." She paused, tracing the wire pathways with her eyes. "A tamper sensor that's wired to detect any attempt to access the main charge. This is a professional job. This is someone with military EOD training. Can you bypass it?" Torres asked. Maya's mind raced through scenarios, techniques, procedures learned over years of training and field experience. The tremor in her hand seemed to intensify as stress flooded her system. But she had learned something over the past 6 months. She had learned to work with it, not against it. She selected a different tool, one with a wider grip that gave her more stability. She braced her forearm against her knee, creating a solid base. Small adaptations, tiny adjustments that made her shake less of a liability and more of just another variable to account for. "I can do it," she said, "but I need silence on the comms." "I need to focus. You've got it," Torres replied. "We're here if you need us." The communication channel went quiet. Maya was alone with the bomb and the clock. 38 minutes. She began with the tamper sensor, the most immediate threat. Any attempt to open the main casing without bypassing it first would result in instant detonation. The sensor was a mercury switch, elegant and simple. Tilt it the wrong way and mercury completes the circuit. Boom. But mercury switches had a weakness. They could only detect gross movement. Slow, careful manipulation could slide something underneath to keep the mercury in place even when the switch was moved. Maya's hands shook as she prepared a thin plastic shim, coating it with conducting gel. She took 3 deep breaths, forcing her heart rate to slow, willing her nervous system to calm. The tremor reduced but didn't disappear. It never disappeared anymore, that was okay. She'd learned to work with it. The shim slid between the switch and its mounting bracket. Slowly, a millimeter at a time, she eased it into position. Sweat ran down her face inside the helmet. Her shoulders ached from holding the awkward position. Her hands continued their subtle shake, but her grip was firm, her movement controlled. The shim clicked into place. Maya released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Tamper sensor bypassed," she said quietly. "Good work, Rodriguez." Torres's voice was warm with relief, but there was no time to celebrate. 34 minutes remained, and she still had to deal with the timer and the remote detonation system. She carefully opened the main casing. Inside was a nightmare of wires and circuits, a deliberately complex maze designed to confuse and intimidate. But Maya had seen worse. In Kandahar, in Iraq, and a dozen other places where people built bombs to kill and destroy, she had faced this kind of complexity and won. Her eyes traced the circuit pathways, identifying the critical connections. The timer was the obvious threat, but it was also a decoy in a way. Cutting it might stop the countdown, but could trigger the remote detonation system as a backup. She needed to disable both simultaneously. "I need to access the remote receiver," she said. "It's buried under the timer assembly. I have to remove 4 components to reach it, and any one of them could be rigged as a secondary trigger." She didn't wait for a response. 29 minutes left. Her hand selected tools, her training guiding each movement. The first component lifted free without incident. The second required cutting 3 wires in a specific sequence. She'd seen this configuration before, knew the pattern. The third component was the problem. Command, she said, staring at the maze of wires. I'm looking at a configuration I haven't seen before. 6 wires, color-coded, but the pattern doesn't match any standard I know. This is custom work. Over the comm, she heard rapid consultation, voices overlapping as the experts debated. Then a new voice cut through, one she recognized with a surge of irritation. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Lieutenant Maines. I'm looking at your camera feed. I think you should consider a controlled detonation. We've evacuated the area. The risk to personnel is still present, Maya interrupted. The munitions in this facility, even residual amounts, could create a much larger explosion. We're doing this my way, silence. Then Torres. Rodriguez is right. Her call, her operation. Proceed, Sergeant. 24 minutes. Maya forced Mains's voice out of her head. She studied the 6 wires, looking for the logic in their arrangement. Bomb makers, even sophisticated ones, followed patterns. The human brain couldn't help it. There was always a logic, always a key to unlock the puzzle. Then she saw it. The wire colors, red, blue, green, yellow, white, black, they weren't random. They were arranged in the order of a resistor color code, a system used in electronics. Black was 0, the ground. That was the key. Her hands shook as she reached for the wire cutters. This was the moment. Right or wrong, life or death. She positioned the cutters around the black wire, took one final breath and squeezed. The wire separated with a soft click. The timer continued, counting down. 22 minutes. But when she carefully moved the component aside, the trap didn't trigger. She'd been right. 1 more layer to go, she whispered.
18 minutes remained when Maya finally exposed the remote detonation receiver. It was a small device, no bigger than a deck of cards, but it represented the final obstacle between 6,000 people and catastrophe. Her hands were shaking worse now. Fatigue, stress, and her condition combined to make the tremor more pronounced. She could hear her own breathing inside the helmet, rapid and shallow. Every muscle in her body ached from the tension of holding precise positions for so long. Talk to me, Rodriguez. What are you seeing? Torres's voice was calm, anchoring. The receiver is wired directly to the detonator. I can't just disconnect it. There's a continuity sensor that will trigger if the circuit is broken. I need to fool it into thinking the connection is still active while I disable the actual trigger mechanism. She was working on pure instinct now, years of experience guiding hands that wouldn't stop shaking. From her kit, she pulled a specialized bypass device, a small circuit board that could mimic electrical signals. If she could splice it in parallel with the receiver, she could maintain continuity while cutting the actual trigger wire. But the work required absolute precision. The wires were tiny, the connections delicate, and her hands were trembling like leaves in a storm. 15 minutes, Chen's voice came over the comm, quiet and tense. Maya blocked it out. There was no room for the clock in her mind right now, no space for fear or doubt. There was only the device, the wires, the precise sequence of actions that would render it safe. She stripped the insulation from the first wire, her shaking hands making the simple task agonizingly difficult. It took 3 attempts to get the bypass device properly positioned. Sweat blurred her vision. She blinked it away, adjusted her headlamp, and continued. The first connection soldered into place. Then the second. The bypass device was live now, feeding a fake signal to the continuity sensor. In theory, she could now cut the actual trigger wire without setting off the bomb dot. In theory. Command, I'm about to sever the primary detonation circuit. If I'm wrong about the bypass, this thing goes off. Recommend all personnel move to maximum safe distance. We're already there, Rodriguez. Trust your training. You've got this. Trust your training. Words she'd heard 1,000 times, words she'd lived by her entire career. Her hands hovered over the trigger wire, cutters in position. The tremor made the wire seem to dance in front of her, but she'd learned to see past it. To find the steady line beneath the shake, she cut the wire. Nothing happened. The timer continued, its countdown. 11 minutes, 42 seconds. Maya allowed herself 1 moment of relief, then refocused. The remote trigger was disabled, but the timer was still active, and now she faced the final challenge, the timer mechanism itself. She examined the assembly carefully. The timer was connected to the detonator through a relay system, a common design that allowed for a simple countdown to trigger a complex explosion. But there would be traps here too. Final protections to punish anyone who made it this far. I'm seeing 2 wires leading from the timer to the relay, she narrated. Standard configuration would be a positive and negative connection, but I'm reading voltage on both wires, which means this isn't standard. There's a 3rd wire here, hidden behind the timer housing. I think it's a trap. 9 minutes. Her hands were shaking so badly now that she had to stop for a moment, pulling back and taking deep breaths. The adrenaline that had sustained her was beginning to fade, leaving behind exhaustion and the full weight of her condition. Rodriguez, are you okay? Walsh's voice, concerned. I'm fine, Maya lied. Just need a second. She wasn't fine. Her hands were a disaster, trembling so much that she could barely hold her tools. Any other day, any other situation, she would have stepped back and let someone else take over. But there was no one else. There was only her, the bomb, and 8 minutes left. Then, through her earpiece, a different voice. Not Torres or her team, but Main's. Sergeant, your hands are visibly unstable. I'm recommending to Captain Torres that we evacuate and prepare for controlled detonation. You've done well to get this far, but it's time to accept that with respect. Sir, shut up. Maya's voice was steel. I'm finishing this job. She didn't wait for a response. Didn't care if she'd just ended her career with insubordination. None of it mattered if she couldn't stop this bomb. 7 minutes. Maya forced her hand steady through sheer willpower. It didn't stop the tremor, but it focused it, channeled it. She had read once that some tremors were actually beneficial in certain situations, that the small vibrations could help with precise muscle control, if you learned to work with them instead of against them. She'd never believed it until now. Now, she felt the shake in her hands and used it, let it guide her fine motor control as she carefully, impossibly carefully, exposed the hidden third wire. It was exactly what she'd suspected. A trap wire, designed to trigger if either of the main timer wires was cut. Sophisticated, professional, deadly. But not unbeatable. I need to cut all 3 wires simultaneously, she said. It's the only way to prevent the trap from triggering. Can you do that? Torres asked. Maya looked at her shaking hands, looked at the 3 wires, each requiring precise cutting at the exact same moment. It should have been impossible. For anyone else it might have been, but Maya Rodriguez had defused over 300 bombs. She had worked in conditions that would have broken most people. She had survived an explosion that should have killed her and come back to keep serving. She selected 3 wire cutters from her kit, each one a slightly different size to fit the different wire gauges. She positioned them carefully, one on each wire, using a small frame she built from spare tools to hold them in alignment. 5 minutes. Her hands shook as she made final adjustments. The cutters had to close at exactly the same instant, within milliseconds of each other. One slip, one miscalculation, and the variation in timing would complete the trap circuit. She rigged a release mechanism, a simple lever that would trigger all 3 cutters simultaneously. Her hands trembled as she made the final preparations, but her mind was crystal clear. This was it. This was everything she'd trained for, everything she'd survived for, all coming down to one moment. Command: I'm initiating final disarm sequence. 3.2.1. She pulled the lever. 3 clicks. So close together they were almost one sound. 3 wires cut. The timer froze at 3 minutes 18 seconds, and then the display went dark. Silence. Absolute silence. Then Chun's voice breaking with emotion. It's dead. The bomb is dead. You did it, Sergeant. Maya sat back on her heels, her whole body shaking now, not just her hands. Adrenaline crash, exhaustion, relief, it all hit her at once. She'd done it, against everything, despite her condition, despite the doubt and the mockery and her own fears. She'd done it. Team Charlie, excellent work. Begin post-incident protocol and secure the device. Torres's voice was warm with pride. Rodriguez, you just saved this entire base. I don't have words for, sir, Maya interrupted quietly. Request permission to walk out under my own power. A pause. Then permission granted. Maya stood, her legs unsteady but holding. She gathered her kits with shaking hands, hands that had just accomplished the impossible. Chen and Walsh met her at the bunker entrance, both of them grinning. That was incredible, Walsh said. I've never seen anything like it. They walked out of the facility together into the dawn light. The sun was just rising over Fort Bragg, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. A crowd had gathered at the security perimeter base. Personnel, commanders, teams that had been standing by in case the worst happened. Captain Torres was waiting at the perimeter. He saluted Maya as she approached, a mark of respect that spoke louder than words. Outstanding work, Sergeant. Absolutely outstanding. Maya returned the salute, her hand still trembling but her spine straight. Thank you, sir. Just doing my job. That was a lot more than just doing your job. Torres gestured to someone in the crowd. Where you have someone who wants to speak with you. Lieutenant Maines emerged from the crowd. His face was pale, and he wouldn't quite meet Maya's eyes. He looked at her shaking hands, and for a long moment, said nothing. Finally, I owe you an apology, Sergeant Rodriguez. Multiple apologies. I made assumptions based on ignorance. You're an exceptional soldier, and I was wrong to question your capabilities. Maya studied him. She could see the words cost him something, that admitting fault didn't come easily. Part of her wanted to throw his mockery back in his face, to make him feel the sting of his own prejudice. But she was too tired for anger, and she'd already proven everything that needed proving. Apology accepted, sir, she said simply. We all have room to learn. Maines nodded, relief crossing his face. He started to turn away, then stopped. For what it's worth, those shaking hands of yours, they just saved 6,000 lives. I don't think anyone will question them again. As he walked away, Chen leaned close to Maya. You know you're going to be a legend after this, right? The story's already spreading. She defused the impossible bomb with shaking hands. You're going to be famous.
Maya looked down at her hands, still tremoring in the morning light. For months, she'd seen them as a weakness, a failure, a reason for doubt. But maybe they were something else. Maybe they were proof that strength wasn't about being perfect or unshaken. Maybe real strength was about being broken in some way and still showing up, still doing the work, still saving lives, even when your own body worked against you. I don't need to be famous, she said quietly. I just need to do my job. But even as she said it, she felt something shift inside her. The weight she'd been carrying since Kandahar, the constant fear that she wasn't good enough anymore, didn't disappear, but it lightened. She had faced the ultimate test with her imperfect hands and won. That night, after the debriefing and the medical checks and the endless paperwork that followed any major incident, Maya returned to her quarters. Her phone had dozens of messages from Emma, who'd somehow already heard the news, from old team members, from friends she hadn't talked to in years, but the one that stopped her was an email from the Army EOD command. The subject line read, Instructor Position, Fort Lee Training Facility. She opened it with shaking hands. The email was an offer to lead the Advanced Tactical Training Program for new EOD specialists. It detailed how her experience and expertise made her an ideal candidate to shape the next generation of bomb technicians. And there, in the final paragraph, was a line that made her breath catch. Your recent actions at Fort Bragg demonstrate not only exceptional technical skill but also the kind of courage under adversity that we want every EOD specialist to embody. Your condition is not a limitation but rather a testament to adaptation and perseverance. Qualities we believe will inspire and educate future service members. Maya read it 3 times. An instructor position was prestigious, a recognition of expertise and leadership. It was also a way forward, a path that would let her continue serving even as her condition potentially progressed. But more than that, it was validation. Not despite her shaking hands, but recognizing that her journey through injury and doubt had made her stronger, wiser, more capable of teaching others. She looked at her hands, trembling as they held the phone, hands that had been mocked, doubted, questioned, hands that had just defused a bomb that should have been impossible, hands that were imperfect but capable of extraordinary things. She typed her response, I accept. 3 months later, Maya stood in front of her first class of EOD trainees at Fort Lee. 20 young soldiers, men and women, all eager and terrified in the way she remembered being at the start of her own career. She held up her hands, letting them see the tremor. Some of you might have heard stories about me, she began, about the Fort Bragg incident, about these hands. What those stories might not tell you is that being a good EOD specialist isn't about having perfect hands or perfect conditions. It's about adapting. It's about working with what you have, even when what you have isn't what you wish it was. She picked up a training device from the table, her shaking hands steady in their purpose despite the tremor. You're all going to face moments that test you. Equipment failures, physical limitations, fear that makes your hands shake even if you don't have a medical condition. The question isn't whether you'll face those moments. The question is whether you'll let them stop you. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Sergeant Rodriguez, how do you work with the shake? How do you trust yourself when your hands won't be still? Maya smiled. It was the question she'd been asking herself for months, and only recently had she found the answer. I trust myself because I know I'm more than my hands, she said. I'm my training, my experience, my determination. The shake is just one variable in a complex equation. You account for it, adapt to it, and keep moving forward. That's what makes you a specialist, not perfection, but persistence. The class nodded, absorbing the lesson. Maya looked at their faces and saw herself years ago, eager to prove herself, desperate to be good enough. She wished she could tell her younger self that being good enough was never about being flawless. It was about showing up even when you were scared, even when you were broken, even when everyone doubted you. It was about having hands that shook and defusing the bomb anyway. That evening, Maya received a text from Captain Torres. Saw your class roster. You're going to be an amazing instructor. The team here still talks about that day, by the way. You set a standard that won't be forgotten. She was typing a response when another message came through. This one from an unknown number. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Lieutenant Maines. I'm leading the investigation into the Fort Bragg device. Thought you'd want to know we identified the bomb maker former military, dishonorably discharged. You were right that it was professional work. Your adaptation protocols are being added to the EOD manual based on how you handled the Your techniques are going to save lives. Congratulations. Maya stared at the message for a long moment. Her techniques, her adaptations, the things she'd developed out of necessity, out of struggle, were now going to be taught to others. The weakness that Maines had mocked was becoming a strength for the entire EOD community. She saved the message and looked out the window at Fort Lee, at the training grounds where tomorrow she'd teach another class of soldiers to face their fears and do the impossible. Her hands were still shaking. They probably always would be, and that was okay, because Sergeant Maya Rodriguez had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the things that make you shake are the same things that make you strong. She picked up her phone with trembling hands and texted back to Torres. Thanks, Captain. Just doing my job. But she was smiling as she typed it, because she knew it was more than that. It was her purpose. It was her proof. It was her victory over every doubt and every voice that said she couldn't. Her hands had shaken, and she'd defused the bomb anyway, and she'd do it again tomorrow, and the day after. And every day that someone needed her steady heart and unstoppable will. Because that's what heroes do. They shake, and they save lives anyway.